The first night on open ground, nobody slept. We'd made it 6 miles south of Caldwell before the light failed. 6 miles that took 7 hours because Mr. Brennan's pace was what it was. And because twice we had to reroute around clusters of abandoned vehicles where shapes moved behind fogged glass. I didn't investigate. I didn't need to. The silhouettes told me enough figures strapped into seatbelts, heads turning slowly toward the sound of 11 people passing on gravel shoulders, mouths working against windows they'd forgotten how to open. We sheltered in a truck stop off the highway. Not inside the building, Kwame checked the interior and came back shaking his head. One word: occupied, but behind it, in a loading bay with a roll-down metal door that still functioned. Adrienne and I pulled it shut from inside, and the sound of corrugated steel hitting concrete rang out across the empty lot like a dinner bell. We sat in the dark and waited to see if anything answered. Nothing did. My father was in his evening fog. He'd been fading since mile 3, his steps shortening, his gaze drifting left toward the tree line, as though tracking something only he could see. Eli walked beside him without being asked, one hand resting lightly on our father's elbow. My brother had developed a talent for invisible support, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply appears where it's needed and disappears when it's not. He was 12 years old and already fluent in a language most adults never learn. I distributed rations in the dark. Cold canned vegetables, crackers, a capful of water per person. The sound of 11 mouths chewing echoed in the loading bay with a strange intimacy. The wet mechanics of survival stripped of all ceremony. Sophie ate silently, mechanically, the way she'd done everything since the shelter. Dana and Laya shared a single can between them, passing it back and forth without a word. Oscar sat against the wall with his knees drawn up, asleep before he finished his crackers. Adrienne found me at the roll-down door where I'd positioned myself to listen. "Shifts?" she asked. 2 hours each. You and me, then Kwame and Sophie, then I'm back on. That's 4 hours of sleep for you. That's enough. It's not. She didn't argue further. She'd learned that about me by now, the distinction between battles worth fighting and walls worth walking around. The twins are scared. Leia was crying during the last mile. Quietly, but Donna noticed, which means everyone noticed. They're 14. They're also tougher than you think. The crying isn't weakness, it's processing. The ones who worry me are the ones who've stopped reacting entirely. Her eyes moved to Sophie, a shape in the dark, distinguishable only by the stillness of her outline. She hasn't spoken in 2 days. I'd noticed. I hadn't known what to do with it. Talk to her tomorrow, I said, during the walk. Not about what happened, about anything else. Give her a task, something that requires verbal response. Adrienne nodded, then quietly. Your father was talking to someone on the road, around mile 4. Full conversation pauses, responses, emotional variation. Eli handled it, but people saw. I know. Marcus, at some point. I know. She let the silence hold for a moment, then touched my arm briefly and moved back into the dark to sleep against her pack. I stayed at the door and pressed my ear to the metal and listened to the world outside wind through the fuel pump canopy, a distant sound that could have been thunder or could have been something structural collapsing miles away. And beneath it all, that low-frequency ambient moan that rose and fell like breath. The infected were out there. Not close, not converging, but present. A permanent weather system on the horizon of every decision. I thought about the shelter. Right then, sealed and dark and empty beneath our house, it felt less like something we'd escaped and more like something we'd outgrown. A chrysalis cracked open from the inside. 34 miles to Ridge Rest. I started counting the hours until dawn. Morning came gray and cold, and with it, my father's clarity. He was sitting upright on his bedroll when I opened my eyes. Legal pad across his knees. Pencil moving with the focused precision I'd learned to associate with his functional hours. He'd been listening to the radio. Kwame had given it to him during the night shift. And he'd filled half a page with notes. Ridge Rest is broadcasting road advisories now, he said without looking up. Highway 5 is passable to mile marker 31. After that, bridge collapse. They're recommending a detour through Harmon Creek, adds 8 miles, but avoids an urban corridor. His handwriting was steady. His voice was measured. The man from yesterday's tree-line conversations was absent, replaced by the engineer, the planner, the version of my father that functioned best when variables demanded solutions. How current is the advisory? Repeated every 90 minutes. Last update referenced a supply convoy arriving from the east 2 days ago. They're active, Marcus. This isn't a recording. He handed me the pad. I read his notes, distances, landmarks, water sources mentioned in the broadcast, estimated travel times adjusted for Mr. Brennan's pace. He'd done the math overnight, and the math was good. 3 days to the detour, 4 to Ridge Rest if we maintain 5 miles per day. Mr. Brennan can't do 5. Then we carry him again when he can't walk. Or we split into a faster group and a slower group with a rendezvous point. He looked up. I know which option you'll choose. We stay together. I know. No argument, just acknowledgement, a father observing his son's principles without attempting to override them. It was new, this dynamic. It still felt borrowed, like wearing someone else's coat. We moved out at first light. The highway south was a graveyard of transit cars, trucks, an overturned RV that had spilled its contents across both lanes like a ruptured organ. Clothing, cookware, a child's stuffed bear face down in an oil stain. Oscar picked up the bear, looked at it, put it down. Nobody commented. The infected were visible at distances. Singles, mostly, standing in fields or at the edges of parking lots, with that vacant patience that defied every predatory instinct I thought I understood. They weren't hunting. They weren't waiting. They simply were present without purpose, existing in a state that felt less like aggression and more like aftermath. The ones near the road turned their heads as we passed, but didn't advance. Whatever stimulus triggered pursuit, sound, proximity, some threshold I hadn't mapped, we stayed beneath it. Mile 8 brought the first complication. Kwame, walking point beside me, stopped and raised his hand. Ahead, maybe 200 yards, a vehicle barricade stretched across the highway. Not accidental, deliberate. Cars pushed nose to tail across both lanes and the median, forming a wall roughly chest height. Behind it, nothing visible. No movement, no sound. Checkpoint? Kwame asked. Was, maybe, not anymore. We approached slowly. The barricade had been constructed with purpose, heavier vehicles on the outside, lighter ones filling gaps, a narrow passage on the far right just wide enough for single-file foot traffic. Someone had spray-painted a message on the side of a minivan in red letters. Ridge Rest, 32 miles, water at marker 19. Stay on road, brake time at chest 0.66. Water at marker 19. Stay on road, God help you. The paint was faded, weeks old at least. It's a waypoint, Adrian said, examining the gap. Someone set this up for travelers. Funneled people through a choke point, probably screened them. Screened them for what? Oscar asked. Nobody answered. We all knew. Screened for bites, for fever, For the early signs, the pupil dilation, the loss of verbal coherence, the subtle wrongness that preceded the full turn. I looked at my father. He was studying the barricade with professional appreciation, noting the engineering, the structural logic. His eyes were clear, engaged, the morning window holding. "Single file," I said. "I go first, Adrian last. Stay tight." I stepped through the gap into whatever waited on the other side. Beyond the barricade, the highway opened into a stretch of rural flatland that offered no cover and complete visibility in every direction. I hated it. The shelter had trained me to think in walls and ceilings, in the comfort of containment. Open space felt like exposure, like standing naked under a searchlight. But the group moved through it with something close to relief, sky above them, distance ahead, the illusion of freedom that open terrain provides. We reached the water point at mile marker 19 by late afternoon. Someone had rigged a hand pump to a well beside an abandoned farmhouse, a length of PVC pipe descending into the earth with a lever mechanism welded from scrap metal. A cardboard sign, protected from weather by a plastic sleeve, read, "Pump slow, prime first, water is clean." We tested it. Adrian tested it again with strips from our supply kit. Clean. We filled every container, drank until our stomachs ached, and rested in the farmhouse yard while the sun hung low and orange through a haze that could have been clouds or smoke from somewhere distant. Mr. Brennan sat on the porch steps while I unwrapped his splint to check the leg. The swelling had reduced. The skin around the break was discolored but no longer fevered to the touch. He'd been taking amoxicillin on schedule, Adrienne administering it with the same no-nonsense regularity she applied to my father's lithium. "Healing," I said. "Slowly." He flexed his foot, winced. "Another week before I trust weight on it fully." "You don't have to. We'll adjust the pace." He looked at me with an expression I'd been seeing more frequently. No, that particular gaze adults give young people who've exceeded expectation without permission. Not admiration. Something more complicated, something tinged with the discomfort of witnessing a natural order inverted. "Your father taught you well," he said. "My father taught me systems. Everything else I learned by necessity. That's how most real teaching works." He leaned back on his hands. "I taught biology for 20 years, Marcus. You know what I actually taught? How to observe without assumption. How to let the data tell you what's happening instead of deciding first and looking for confirmation. Your father decided the world would end and built a bunker. You observed what was actually happening and adapted. Both approaches kept people alive. But only one of them scales." I didn't respond immediately. The observation was precise enough to feel like surgery, not painful, but uncomfortably revelatory. My father's certainty had built the shelter. My flexibility had opened it. And both of those impulses lived in me now, competing for control of every decision. That evening, something shifted in the group's texture. The farmhouse yard became, briefly, something other than a survival camp. Oscar found a guitar in the house, missing 2 strings but functional. He sat on the porch railing and picked out a melody I half recognized, something simple and repetitive that settled over the group like a blanket. Dana and Laya leaned against each other and closed their eyes. Sophie, who hadn't spoken voluntarily in 3 days, turned toward the sound with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Kwame sat beside Mr. Brennan, and they talked quietly about what I couldn't hear. My father was at the radio, still monitoring, but his hands had stilled on the dial. He was listening to Oscar play. Eli found me at the edge of the yard, watching the perimeter from habit. "You don't have to stand guard every second," he said. Someone does. Kwame's taking first watch. He already told me. Eli sat in the grass beside me. Marcus, when we get to Ridge Rest, what happens? We integrate, contribute, find a role. What about Dad? The question carried weight my brother didn't attempt to conceal. He was asking what I'd been avoiding, the long-term calculation, the one that extended beyond arrival into the complicated territory of permanence. They have medical resources. Adrienne heard them mention a psychiatric nurse on one of the broadcasts. Will he let someone help him? I watched our father across the yard, bathed in orange light, his face slack with something that resembled peace. And I told my brother the only honest answer I had. I don't know, but it won't be only our problem anymore. Eli nodded, accepted it. The guitar played on. Mile marker 31 arrived on the morning of day 3. The bridge was exactly as the broadcast described, a 2-lane span over Harmon Creek that had collapsed from its center, both halves sagging into the water like broken arms. The creek itself was swollen, dark, maybe 40 feet across, and moving with a current that suggested depth. No crossing on foot. The detour was the only option. We turned east on a county road that cut through farmland gone wild. Cornfields unharvested, the stalks brown and brittle, standing like an army of the abandoned. The road was narrow, cracked, bordered by drainage ditches that offered minimal concealment if we needed it. I didn't like the sight lines. The corn was tall enough to hide movement within 20 feet of the road, and the wind through the dead stalks produced a constant rustling that masked ambient sound. "This is a bad corridor," Adrienne said beside me. She'd moved to the front after the second mile, gravitating toward risk with a directness I'd stopped questioning. 8 miles of it. Can we do it in a day? Not with Mr. Brennan. Then we camp in corn country. Unless we find something better. We found something better at mile 4 of the detour, a grain elevator complex. 3 massive cylindrical silos connected by conveyor infrastructure, with a small office building at the base. The silos were sealed, inaccessible without equipment. But the office building was intact, single-story cinder block, with a steel door and windows small enough to barricade. Defensible. I sent Kwame and Oscar to clear the interior. They returned in minutes, empty, undisturbed. A desk and filing cabinets, and a bathroom with a toilet that no longer flushed, but whose tank still held clean water. Good enough. We settled in for the night, packing the small space tightly, bodies arranged like puzzle pieces on the concrete floor. Mr. Brennan took the desk chair, his leg elevated on a filing cabinet. My father sat in the corner by the door, evening fog descending on schedule, his lips moving in their silent conversation. I took first watch outside, sitting on the office steps with the hunting knife across my knees. The grain elevator towered above me, its silos catching the last daylight like silver monuments. The cornfield stretched in every direction, and in the fading light, the dead stalks looked like the bars of an enormous cage. An hour into my watch, I heard them. Not the ambient moan, something different. Footsteps, multiple, arrhythmic, coming from the cornfield to the north. The stalks moving against a pattern that wasn't wind. Something was coming through the corn. And it wasn't trying to be quiet, because it didn't know what quiet was for. I stood, back toward the door, counted the disruptions in the corn, 3, 4, 6 points of movement converging on the clearing around the grain elevator. Inside, I shook Kwame awake with a hand over his mouth. He read my face instantly. We woke Adrienne. The three of us positioned ourselves at the windows while everyone else stayed low and silent on the floor. They emerged from the corn in ones and twos. 6 of them, then 8, then 11. Not a horde, a fragment, a splinter group separated from whatever larger migration had brought them through. They moved across the clearing with that characteristic drift, directionless but persistent, bumping against the silos, circling the conveyor supports, drawn by nothing in particular but unable to stop moving. One reached the office building, pressed its face against the window where Sophie crouched below the sill. The glass fogged with its breath they breathed. That detail always unnerved me, and a low sound escaped its throat. Interrogatory, almost curious. Sophie's hand found mine in the dark. Her fingers were ice. The face withdrew. The figure moved on, joining the others in their circuit around the silos. For 3 hours, they orbited us. 11 shapes in the dark, passing the windows at intervals I tried to time but couldn't predict. 11 reminders that shelter was always temporary and safety was always conditional. Near midnight, they drifted south into the corn and didn't return. Sophie's hand was still in mine. I didn't let go until dawn. We left the grain elevator at first light, moving fast, pushing Mr. Brennan's pace until he grimaced but didn't complain. The remaining 4 miles of the detour passed through open farmland that gradually transitioned to low hills and scattered timber. The corn fell behind us, and with it, the claustrophobia of blind corridors. The road rejoined the highway at a junction marked by a hand-painted sign nailed to a telephone pole. Ridgerist, 24 miles south on 5. You're close. Keep going. Someone had added below it in different handwriting. Watch for scouts at mile 15. They're friendly. Don't run. 24 miles. 5 days at our pace. Maybe 4, if Mr. Brennan's leg cooperated. The sign's existence was itself a data point. Someone maintained this route, updated it, cared enough about strangers to offer reassurance. The infrastructure of human consideration, surviving despite everything. My father read the sign 3 times. I watched him absorb the handwriting, the paint, the nail driven into wood with purpose. Organized, he murmured. It was mid-morning. His window was holding. Perimeter communication, designated contact points. These people have structure. Is that good? Structure means rules. Rules mean someone's in charge. He looked at me. You'll need to figure out fast who that is and what they expect. It was the most fatherly thing he'd said in a week. Strategic, forward-looking, protective. I filed it alongside the conversation on the shelter stairs, another fragment of the man he intermittently was. Mile 15 came on day 5. We saw the scouts before they saw us, 2 figures on a ridge overlooking the highway, one with binoculars, both carrying rifles slung across their backs. My group froze instinctively. 11 people suddenly motionless on the road, staring up at 2 strangers with weapons. I stepped forward, hands visible, palms out. We heard your broadcasts, I called. 11 people, 1 injured. We're coming from Caldwell. A pause. The binoculars came down. One scout spoke into a handheld radio, words I couldn't hear. Then a voice carried down from the ridge. Female, steady. How long on the road? 5 days from Caldwell. 40 days since the outbreak. Anyone bitten? No. Anyone sick? The question hung in the air. I felt my father's presence behind me, felt the group's collective awareness of what sick meant in this context. 2 kinds of sick existed now, and the distinction between them was the difference between welcome and exile. No one's infected, I said carefully. One broken leg healing. One person with a pre-existing medical condition being managed with medication. Another radio exchange. Then, come up the road, slowly. We'll meet you at the bridge. The bridge was a quarter-mile ahead, a small concrete span over a dry creek bed. The scouts descended and met us there. A man and a woman, both in their 30s, both carrying the particular weariness of people who'd been doing this long enough to have systems, but not long enough to trust them. The woman introduced herself as Garrett. She checked Mr. Brennan's leg with practiced hands, examined each of us for visible wounds, asked questions with clinical efficiency. When she reached my father, she paused. He was in his late morning transition, the sharpness beginning to blur at the edges. Sir, can you tell me your name? David Chen. Clear, present, holding. Any medical conditions? He looked at me. A single glance, weighted with everything we'd navigated together, the episodes, the medication, the night on the stairs. I saw him make a decision. Bipolar disorder, he said. Possibly schizoaffective. My son's been managing my medication. Lithium and olanzapine. I'm not always... He paused, swallowed. I'm not always reliable. Garrett's expression didn't change. She wrote on a clipboard, "We have a psychiatric nurse, Mara. She'll want to see you." My father nodded, and I watched his shoulders drop by an inch, a tension releasing that had lived in his body since the first night, since the shaking hands and the combination lock, and the fluorescent light spilling up from underground. The weight of being the only system shifting, at last, toward distribution. Garrett looked at me. You're the one who led them here. We led each other. She almost smiled. Welcome to Ridge Rest. Let's get you inside. Ridge Rest was not what I'd imagined. I'd pictured something provisional, tents, campfires, the aesthetic of desperation organized into rows. What we found was a town that had decided to continue being a town. The perimeter was serious. Vehicles and earth berms forming a wall around a 12-block core, with watch positions at intervals and a gate system that funneled arrivals through a checkpoint. But inside the perimeter, the streets were swept. Gardens grew in former parking lots. A hand-painted sign on what had been a hardware store read, "Community Supply, take what you need, log what you take." They processed us through intake medical assessments, skills inventories, housing assignments. The efficiency suggested practice. We weren't the first group to arrive. We wouldn't be the last. My father was taken to see Mara within the first hour. He went without protest, walking beside Garrett with a docility that would have alarmed me a month ago, but now registered as relief. He was entering a system designed to catch him. For the first time since the shelter, I didn't need to be the net. The rest of us were assigned to a repurposed motel on the perimeter's east side. 2 rooms for 11 people crowded, but luxury compared to the shelter. Real beds. Running water from a gravity-fed system that drew from a creek to the south. A communal kitchen in the former lobby where someone had left a pot of soup on a propane burner with a note. For new arrivals. Eli ate 3 bowls. I watched him from across the lobby and felt something unknot in my chest that had been tightened so long I'd stopped noticing it. My brother, eating soup in a place with windows. The simplicity of that image contained more hope than any broadcast signal. Adrienne disappeared into the medical station within hours of arrival and didn't come back until evening. She returned carrying a box of supplies and wearing an expression I hadn't seen on her face before engagement. The look of someone who'd found a problem worth solving that wasn't immediate survival. They have resources, she said, sitting beside me on the motel steps. Not enough, never enough, but organized. Antibiotics, surgical tools, anesthetic. Their nurse, Mara, she's been training people. Field medicine. They've done amputations, Marcus. Set bones. Treated infections with improvised IV lines. And my father? She evaluated him. Said the medication regimen was appropriate given the circumstances. She's adjusting the dosage, adding a mood stabilizer he hasn't been on. She wants to see him daily. Adrian paused. She also said you did something remarkable, managing his condition without training, without support, for weeks. She said most adults wouldn't have managed it. I didn't know what to do with praise that felt like being thanked for drowning slowly instead of all at once. What about Mr. Brennan? His leg needs to be rebroken and set properly. Mara can do it, but he needs to be stronger first. Another week of nutrition and rest. The logistics of healing, the mathematics of recovery, different numbers than the shelter's countdown. These were additive rather than subtractive, measuring what was being rebuilt instead of what was being consumed. That night, the group scattered for the first time. Not far within the same motel, the same block, but into separate spaces, separate silences. Oscar found other teenagers and sat with them around a fire pit, the guitar he'd carried from the farmhouse, drawing a small audience. Kwame volunteered for perimeter watch, channeling his vigilance into structure. The twins found a room of their own and closed the door, claiming privacy as though it were oxygen. Sophie spoke. Not to me, to a woman at the community kitchen who asked her name. Sophie Hale, she said. And the woman wrote it in a ledger. And Sophie watched her own name being recorded in a place that intended to remember it. I stood at the motel window and watched the town settle into its evening rhythm. Lanterns in windows, voices carrying across the street. A dog barking somewhere, a dog, alive, kept, cared for. Evidence of continuity. Evidence that the world had not ended so much as contracted, pulled itself into smaller, denser configurations, and continued. 33 days on the surface. 43 since the night my father's hands shook. We had arrived somewhere. The question now was who we'd become once arrival stopped being the goal. The first week in Ridge Rest was a study in decompression. And decompression, I learned, is not the same as relief. In the shelter, every hour had been structured around threat assessment, resource management, and the minute-by-minute calibration of my father's condition. My nervous system had adapted to that rhythm, cortisol as currency, hypervigilance as baseline. Ridge Rest offered safety, relative safety, safety contingent on walls and watches and collective effort. But safety nonetheless. And my body didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch. I'd jerk awake in the motel bed with my pulse hammering, certain I'd heard bolts turning, certain the door was opening, certain that the low moan of wind through the perimeter gaps was something else entirely. By the third night, I stopped trying to sleep in the bed and sat in a chair by the window instead, watching the street until dawn grayed the sky. Eli noticed. Of course he did. "You look terrible," he said on morning 4, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs across the kitchen counter. Real eggs from actual chickens that someone in Ridge Rest had the foresight to maintain through the collapse. The taste was so aggressively normal that it felt hallucinatory. "I'm fine." "You're not sleeping." "I'm adjusting." "Marcus." He sat across from me with the directness he'd developed underground, the refusal to accept deflection that he'd learned from watching me do it to our father. "You spent 6 weeks keeping everyone alive. You don't have to do that here. Other people are doing it." "I know." Knowing isn't the same as believing. 12 years old. Now 13, his birthday had passed underground without acknowledgement, a fact that struck me with delayed guilt so acute it felt physical. We'd missed his birthday. I'd missed it. Too busy managing medication schedules and radio frequencies and the daily architecture of crisis to notice my brother turning 13 in a concrete box. "I'm sorry about your birthday," I said. He blinked, processed the non sequitur, smiled, not broadly, but genuinely. The first unguarded expression I'd seen from him since before the shelter. "You can make it up to me by sleeping tonight." I tried. I managed 4 hours, progress measured in minutes. My father's treatment under Mara's care showed results by the end of the first week. The medication adjustment stabilized his cycles, not eliminated them, but smoothed the peaks and valleys into something navigable. His morning windows extended. His evening declines became gentler, more like fatigue than fracture. He still murmured sometimes, still conversed with absences. But the episodes were shorter, and he recognized them afterward. Could name what had happened with a clinical detachment that suggested the medication was restoring his self-awareness alongside his stability. "I lost time yesterday," he told me on day 6. We were sitting on the motel steps in early afternoon, watching a work crew reinforce a section of the perimeter wall. "About an hour. Mara says that will improve." "How do you feel?" He considered the question with more care than I'd seen him give anything in weeks. "Present," he said. "Not fully, not the way I was before, but more than I've been." He looked at his hands. Steady. "You were putting lithium in my soup." It wasn't a question. I didn't deny it. "Cream of mushroom," I said. "Thick enough to hide the grit." "Adrian told me. She said you started on day 9. "I did." He was quiet for a long moment. The work crew hammered. Somewhere, a child laughed. There were children in ridge rest, a sound I hadn't heard in so long it felt archaeological, unearthed from a previous civilization. "You shouldn't have had to do that," he said. "No. I should have been taking them myself, before the shelter, before any of this. Your mother told me. Every doctor told me. I thought I needed the edges, the sharpness. I thought the medication would dull the part of me that could see what was coming." "Could you? See it coming?" "No." A pause. I saw my own fear and mistook it for prophecy. I sat with that sentence for a long time, turning it over, feeling its weight distribute across everything I understood about my father and everything I was still learning. I was assigned to logistics on day 8. Not because I volunteered, because Garrett recommended me. She'd watched how our group moved, who they looked to when decisions needed making, and she'd drawn her conclusions. The logistics team operated out of the former town hall, a squat brick building at Ridgerest Center. Maps covered every wall, hand-drawn, annotated, updated daily with scouting reports and supply inventories. The team leader was a man named Hobbs, former truck dispatcher from Boise who'd walked south with a group of 19 and arrived with 11. He didn't talk about the 8 who didn't make it. I didn't ask. "You're the kid from Caldwell," he said on my first morning. Not unkindly, assessing. "Marcus Chen. Garrett says you managed 11 people for 40 days, including a medical emergency and a compromised authority figure." He paused. "That's her phrasing, compromised authority figure. My father." "I know. She also says you mapped a 6-block scavenging territory, executed a rescue operation from a breached school, and transitioned your group from static shelter survival to mobile surface operations at 16. I had help. Everybody has help. The question is what you do with it." He spread a map across the table. Ridge Arrest and its surrounding territory extending 20 miles in each direction. We're growing. 12 new arrivals this week. Your group plus a family of 3 from the west. Every person adds to capacity and to demand. My job is making sure the second number never exceeds the first. Your job is helping me do it. I leaned over the map and felt something I hadn't felt since the shelter's early days. The engagement of a problem that had solutions, the satisfaction of logistics as a language I spoke fluently because my father had taught it to me in fluorescent light with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil. The work consumed me, and I let it. Supply chain mapping, resource allocation, distribution schedules, route planning for scavenging teams. The mathematics of community survival were larger than the shelter's equations, but structurally identical inputs, outputs, reserves, margins. What could be carried? What could be sustained? What would break if neglected? Adrienne integrated into the medical team with a speed that surprised no one who'd seen her operate. Within days, she was assisting Mara with patient assessments, learning wound care, studying the improvised pharmacology that passed for medicine in a world without supply chains. Her competence attracted others. Kwame joined the medical support staff, carrying supplies and maintaining the treatment space. Oscar apprenticed to a woman who managed the community garden, discovering an aptitude for cultivation that the apocalypse had improbably revealed. The twins enrolled in Ridge Arrest School. A school? Somehow, improbably, someone had decided that children should continue learning. And 3 former teachers held classes in a church basement 4 mornings a week. Dana and Laya sat in plastic chairs and opened salvaged textbooks and did mathematics while the world outside continued its transformation. Mr. Brennan's surgery happened on day 12. Mara rebroke his femur under anesthesia, improvised from veterinary ketamine, and reset it with proper alignment. He screamed once, briefly, before the drugs took him under. When he woke, the leg was casted in plaster salvaged from a dental office. And his eyes held the particular clarity of someone who'd passed through a threshold and emerged on the other side of it. "Tell me about your school's biology lab," Mara said to him during recovery. "Equipment, specimens, anything we could use." He described it from memory: microscopes, preserved specimens, chemical stocks, and I watched Mara's expression sharpen with acquisition hunger. Resources. The world had been reorganized around what could be found, repurposed, reclaimed. Every memory of the old world was a potential map to something useful in this one. Sophie volunteered for perimeter watch. The quiet girl who hadn't spoken for days chose the duty that required the most solitary vigilance. And in the silence of her watch shifts, she found something I recognized: the particular piece of responsibility, the way duty structures the mind when emotion threatens to dissolve it. We were all finding our shapes in Ridge Rest, fitting ourselves into the spaces a living community offered. But fitting in is not the same as belonging. And belonging was a process none of us had completed yet. The crisis arrived on day 19, and it arrived from inside. A man named Coulter had been in Ridge Arrest since its founding, one of the original residents who'd organized the perimeter and established the community's early governance. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, competent, and he carried the authority of someone who'd been present when the rules were written. He also carried, I would learn, the conviction that those rules belonged to him. The conflict started over resources, specifically the antibiotics my father's shelter still held. Hobbs had asked me to inventory the shelter as a potential resupply point, and I'd confirmed it during a solo trip back to Caldwell. The shelter was intact, undiscovered, its remaining supplies exactly as we'd left them. Months of canned food, medical supplies, water filtration components, a significant strategic reserve. Coulter wanted it consolidated into the community stockpile immediately. All of it. No exceptions. Community resources for the community, he said at the town meeting. Ridgerest held them weekly in the church, attendance optional but socially mandatory. 53 people arranged in pews, watching. Private reserves undermine collective security. If that shelter has 6 months of antibiotics, those belong to everyone. Those belong to my father, I said from my seat. He built that shelter. He purchased those supplies. They're not community property. Your father is a patient under Mara's care. He's not a decision maker. The room shifted. I felt it the same atmospheric pressure change I'd felt in the shelter when my father's role had transferred to me. But this was different. In the shelter, the shift had been organic, born from necessity and intimacy. Here it was political. Coulter was using my father's illness as leverage, reframing his condition as incompetence to justify seizure. I'm the decision maker, I said, for our group, for those supplies, and I'm proposing a share 50% integrated into community stock, 50% maintained as a reserve under our group stewardship, available for emergencies, accessible to medical staff, but not absorbed. That's not how this works. That's how it should work. Every group that arrives brings something. The family from the West brought fuel cans and a working generator. The Boise group brought tools and expertise. Taking private resources completely removes the incentive for future groups to share honestly. They'll hide what they have. The room was quiet. Hobbs watched from the back with an expression I couldn't read. Garrett stood by the door, arms folded, neutral. Coulter leaned forward. You're 16 years old. You've been here less than 3 weeks. You don't get to redesign our resource policy. I'm not redesigning anything. I'm negotiating. That's what people do when they have something others need. I heard my father's voice in my own, not the murmuring. The other voice. The strategic one. The one that calculated without flinching. And I heard something else too. Something that was mine alone. The understanding that power in a community isn't taken or given. It's demonstrated. It exists in the space between what you have and what you're willing to share, and the terms under which you share it. The vote went my way. Narrowly 31-22, but decisively. The compromise stood. Our shelter's supplies would be shared on terms that preserved our group's autonomy while contributing to the collective. Coulter accepted the result with a stiffness that told me the conflict wasn't over, only deferred. Afterward, Hobbs found me outside the church. You handled that well. I handled it the only way I could. Coulter's not wrong about everything. Centralized resources are easier to manage. Your proposal creates administrative complexity. Administrative complexity is better than resentment. He studied me. How old are you again? Old enough to know that when someone asks that question, they're not actually asking about age. He almost laughed. Didn't quite make it. But the architecture of it was there. The facial muscles engaging, the breath preparing. Then he nodded and walked away. And I stood in the evening air and felt the adrenaline drain from my body like water from the shelter's drums, slowly, completely, leaving me hollow and trembling in the dark. I'd won a political fight in a post-apocalyptic town meeting at 16. I wanted my father. I wanted him lucid and sharp and telling me what came next. Instead, I walked back to the motel alone and sat in my chair by the window and didn't sleep again. Coulter retaliated quietly. not with confrontation with erosion. Over the following week, small things shifted. Our group's scavenging assignments grew longer and more distant. Kwame was moved from medical support to perimeter labor without explanation. The twins' classroom schedule changed, pushing their sessions to afternoon hours that conflicted with the communal meal. Incremental displacements, each one defensible in isolation, each one part of a pattern. Adrian saw it first. She had an instinct for institutional maneuvering that I lacked. The pattern recognition of someone who'd navigated difficult systems before the world ended. "He's isolating us," she said. We were in the medical station, where she'd been cataloging the antibiotic supply from our shelter contribution. Separating our people from community integration points. If we're not embedded in the social fabric, we're easier to push out. Push out? He can't exile us. Not formally, but he can make staying uncomfortable enough that we self-select out. Or he can frame us as divisive, as the group that fights community decisions, that hoards resources, that destabilize consensus. We didn't hoard. We negotiated. I know that. You know that. But narrative is a resource too, Marcus, and culture controls more of it than we do. She was right. I'd been thinking in logistics, inputs, outputs, material calculations. Culture was operating in a different register entirely. The politics of belonging, the leverage of who gets defined as us and who remains them. I brought it to Hobbs. He listened, made notes, said he'd address it. The assignments didn't change. Kwame stayed on perimeter labor. The twins' schedule remained disrupted. Hobbs was either unwilling or unable to override Coulter's influence, and the distinction between those two possibilities mattered less than their shared result. On day 26, my father had his worst episode since the shelter. It happened during the community meal, the one public gathering where Ridgerest performed its cohesion. 50-plus people in the church hall eating together, passing dishes, the civilized ritual of shared sustenance. My father was seated between Eli and Mr. Brennan, eating steadily, participating in quiet conversation. His medication had been stable. Mara had expressed cautious optimism about his trajectory. Then something triggered him. I never identified what a sound, a phrase, an association buried too deep for external mapping. He stood abruptly, knocking his plate to the floor, and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire room. "Ellen, I told you to take the boys. I told you it wasn't safe. Why didn't you listen?" Silence. Every head turned. My father stood in the center of Ridgerest's community hall, arguing with a woman who wasn't there, his eyes focused on a point above the heads of the people around him, his hands gesturing with the emphasis of someone deep in a conversation that was, for him, entirely real. Eli reached for his arm. I was already moving, crossing the room from my seat near the door, but Coulter was closer. He stood from his table and positioned himself between my father and the room with the performative concern of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "David, you need to sit down. Someone get Mara." "Don't touch him," I said, arriving. "I've got him. This is a community space. He's disrupting." "I said I've got him." I took my father's arm and spoke directly into his ear. The same tone I'd used in the shelter, the same words. "Dad, listen to my voice. You're here. You're in Ridgerest. Mom's not here right now. I need you to sit down." His eyes refocused in stages. First the gesturing stopped. Then his gaze lowered from its fixed point. Then he saw me. The confusion arrived like weather, clouding his features as the episode receded and the gap in his narrative opened beneath him. "Marcus, Sit down, Dad. It's okay. He sat. Eli handed him water. Mr. Brennan placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Around us, the room exhaled and resumed its meal, with the practiced avoidance of people who'd agreed not to see what they'd just seen. But Coulter had seen it. And in his expression, I recognized something worse than hostility-utility. My father's episode wasn't a problem for Coulter. It was a tool, evidence for whatever argument he was building, proof that our group carried liabilities that the community shouldn't bear. The architecture of my father's vulnerability was becoming someone else's weapon, and I didn't yet know how to disarm it. The confrontation came 3 days later, and it came wrapped in reasonableness. Coulter requested a private meeting him, me, Garrett, and Hobbs in the town hall. He sat across the table with a folder of papers, actual papers, documentation he'd assembled with a thoroughness that told me he'd been planning this long before the dinner incident. "I want to be clear that this isn't personal," he began. "Go ahead." "Your father is a liability, not a judgment, a medical fact. His episodes are unpredictable, publicly disruptive, and represent a security risk. If he has an episode at the perimeter, near the gate, during a crisis, he's under medical care. Mara is managing his treatment. Mara is managing 12 patients with inadequate resources. She doesn't have the capacity for intensive psychiatric monitoring, and your father requires exactly that." He opened the folder. "I'm proposing a structured arrangement. David stays in Ridge Rest under supervised care, but your group's integration becomes contingent on behavioral guarantees that you frankly can't provide." "Contingent how?" "Restricted access to community decision-making until your group has been here 90 days. Consolidation of your remaining shelter supplies into community stock. And your father housed in the medical ward rather than independent quarters." Institutionalized. He was proposing to institutionalize my father and strip our group's standing in a single administrative motion. And he'd framed it so cleanly, so reasonably, that disagreeing would look like prioritizing personal attachment over community safety. I looked at Garrett. Her face was neutral. Hobbs studied his hands. "No," I said. "Marcus, no. My father isn't a ward of this community. He's a member of it. He has a condition that's being treated, and his worst episode in 3 weeks was a 60-second disruption at dinner that nobody was harmed by. You're using his illness to consolidate control over resources and decision-making, and everyone at this table knows it." Coulter's composure didn't crack. He'd expected resistance. "This isn't about control. This is about 53 people's safety versus one person's instability." "Then put it to a vote, like last time. Let the community decide." "The community isn't qualified to assess psychiatric risk." "And you are?" Silence. The room's temperature changed. Garrett shifted in her chair. Hobbs looked up. "I'll tell you what I'm willing to do," I said. "My father will attend weekly check-ins with Mara. I will provide written updates on his condition to whoever needs them. If he has an episode that presents an actual safety risk, not a social discomfort, an actual risk, we'll discuss enhanced supervision. But he lives with his family. He participates in community life, and our group's standing isn't conditional on his diagnosis." Coulter looked at Garrett. She looked at Hobbs. Something passed between them that I wasn't part of. Some prior conversation or understanding that existed in the space before I'd entered the room. "That's reasonable," Garrett said. Coulter's jaw tightened. He closed the folder. "Fine. Weekly check-ins, written updates. But I want it on record that I raised this concern." "Noted," Hobbs said. And the meeting ended. I walked outside into bright midday sun and found Adrian waiting on the town hall steps. She'd known about the meeting I hadn't told her, which meant someone else had, which meant Ridgerest's information networks were more developed than I'd mapped. How bad? Manageable. He wanted Dad committed and our group demoted. I negotiated it down to check-ins and paperwork. You keep negotiating with someone who's trying to remove you. What's the alternative? She looked at me with an expression that combined admiration and frustration in proportions I couldn't separate. The alternative is allies. You're fighting this alone because you think leading means absorbing every blow personally. But there are people here who see what Coulter's doing. Garrett pushed back for you in that room. Hobbs has been moving slowly because he doesn't have support. Give him support. How? By being useful to more people than just your group. By making your presence in this community so integrated that removing you would cost more than keeping you. She'd learned this somewhere. Before the outbreak, the politics of institutional survival. I didn't ask where. Everyone carried a before, and most of us carried it silently. Okay, I said. Show me how. The next month was the hardest work I'd done since the shelter, and none of it involved the dead. Adrienne's strategy was simple in concept and exhausting in execution, embedded so deeply in Ridgerest's operations that our group's removal would be structural damage, not housekeeping. I took on additional logistics responsibilities, extending route planning from local scavenging to regional trade mapping. The Ridgerest broadcast had attracted responses from 3 other settlements within a 60-mile radius, each with resources and needs that complemented ours. I designed the exchange framework what we had, what they had, what the roads between us looked like, what the transport costs were in risk and fuel. Hobbs gave me the project because nobody else wanted the complexity. I took it because complexity was the language my father had taught me, and because the work made me indispensable in exactly the way Adrienne had prescribed. Kwame returned to the medical team after Garrett intervened on his reassignment. He became Mara's primary assistant, developing a competence in wound care that drew on reserves of patience and precision I hadn't seen in him before. Mr. Brennan, walking now with a slight but permanent limp, joined the teaching staff and brought to Ridgerest's makeshift school the structured rigor of a professional educator. The twins thrived under his instruction. Oscar's garden apprenticeship evolved into a leadership role when his mentor moved to perimeter construction, leaving him responsible for the community's primary food production initiative at 14 years old. Sophie remained on perimeter watch, and in her quiet competence, she became one of the most trusted sentries in Ridgerest's rotation. The girl who hadn't spoken for 3 days now provided nightly security briefings with the composed detail of someone who'd found in observation a form of speech more comfortable than conversation. My father stabilized. Not recovered Mara was careful with that distinction, but stabilized. The medication held. His lucid hours extended to 12, sometimes 14 per day. The evening declines became predictable enough to schedule around, and his episodes, when they came, were briefer and less disorienting. He recognized them now, could feel the onset and remove himself before the public disruption that Coulter had weaponized. He worked on the water treatment system. Ridgerest's original setup was crude creek water filtered through sand and charcoal with UV exposure for sterilization. My father redesigned it, incorporating ceramic filtration elements salvaged from hardware stores across the county, adding redundancy and improving throughput by 40%. The project took 3 weeks and produced a system that Hobbs called the single most significant infrastructure improvement since Ridgerest's founding. My father heard the compliment and nodded once, then returned to calibrating flow rates with a focus that transcended acknowledgement. He didn't need praise. He needed purpose, and in the mechanical logic of water purification, he found a continuation of what the shelter had been, a system he could control. A problem with solutions, a structure that answered his need for order without requiring the fuel of catastrophic urgency. I watched him work one afternoon from across the treatment site, and Mara appeared beside me. "He's remarkable," she said. "The engineering knowledge alone would make him valuable. But it's more than that. He understands flow, systems thinking at an intuitive level that I've rarely seen. That's the part the illness didn't touch. No, that's the part the illness enhanced. Bipolar mania produces exactly this kind of focused, pattern-driven productivity. His shelter, this water system, they're expressions of the same cognitive architecture. The question was never whether the engine worked. It was whether anyone could steer it. "I steered it," I said. "Badly. For weeks." "You steered it well enough to get 11 people here alive. That's not badly. That's extraordinary under impossible circumstances." She paused. "But you should know that your father's condition is chronic. Medication manages it. It doesn't cure it. He'll have good years and difficult years. And the difficult ones will require the same thing you've already provided someone who sees him clearly and stays anyway." "I know. Do you also know that you're allowed to be tired?" The question landed somewhere I'd been protecting. A sealed room within myself that I hadn't opened because opening it meant acknowledging what was inside. Exhaustion so deep it felt geological, layered over months, compressed into something dense and permanent. "Not yet," I said, "but soon." The trade convoy left Ridgerest on day 62. 3 vehicles, a pickup truck, a repurposed school bus, and a sedan with reinforced windows carrying supplies south to a settlement called Miller's Fork in exchange for seed stock and diesel fuel. I was the convoy's logistics coordinator, responsible for route planning, resource allocation, and contingency protocols. Hobbs had approved the mission. Garrett led the security detail. My father had calculated the fuel requirements and water needs with morning window precision. Eli asked to come. I said no. He argued. I held. "You're 13. You stay inside the perimeter." "You were 16 when you left the shelter. That's only 3 years more." "Those 3 years nearly killed me, Eli. Stay here. Watch Dad. I'll be back in 4 days." He accepted it with a controlled frustration that had become his signature emotion, the recognition that argument was futile, delivered with just enough resistance to preserve his dignity. He was becoming someone specific, my brother. Not a shadow of me, not a smaller version of our father, but his own shape, defined by the pressures that had formed him in ways only he would fully understand. The road south was different than the road we'd traveled to reach Ridgerest. The infected population had thinned visibly, whether from degradation, migration, or the work of other survivor groups. The highway held fewer shapes and more silence. Abandoned vehicles lined the shoulders like a permanent installation, rusting slowly into the landscape, becoming features rather than obstacles. Garrett drove the lead truck. I rode beside her with maps spread across my knees and the radio tuned to Miller's Fork's frequency. "First trade mission?" she asked. "First mission of any kind that isn't about immediate survival." That's what recovery looks like. The shift from reactive to proactive. Responding to what's happening versus building toward what you want to happen. Is that what Ridgerest's doing? Building? Ridgerest is doing what every surviving community is doing, making it up as we go and calling it strategy after the fact. She steered around a jackknife trailer. Coulter thinks structure comes from control. Hobbs thinks it comes from logistics. Mara thinks it comes from health. You think it comes from connection. I think it comes from all of those things. That's why you're dangerous to Coulter. You understand synthesis. He only understands hierarchy. Miller's Fork was smaller than Ridgerest, 30 people in a fortified farmstead built around a 19th century barn. They had arable land, irrigation from a spring-fed well, and the seed stock we needed for Ridgerest's agricultural expansion. What they lacked was medical knowledge, mechanical expertise, and the security infrastructure that a larger population enabled. The trade took 2 days. I negotiated the terms seed stock and seasonal surplus for antibiotics, water treatment components, and a commitment to share scouting intelligence about the territory between us. The conversations happened over meals, around fires, in the practical shorthand of people who'd learned that trust is transactional before it's emotional. On the second evening, a woman named Irene, Miller's Fork's de facto leader, asked me about Caldwell. "The school where you found those kids," she said. "How many were left when you went back?" I didn't go back to the school, just the shelter. I had a niece at Caldwell Elementary. Different school, I know, but Pine Street is close. Pine Street, the elementary school. The woman's broadcast I'd heard on day 3 in the shelter. 43 people, 11 children under 10. My father had turned the dial away. "I heard a broadcast from Pine Street," I said. "Early days. People were alive there. Did anyone get them out?" "I don't know. I was underground." She nodded. Didn't press, but the names I'd memorized surfaced unbidden. Jamie Orozco, age 7. Destiny Washington, age 4. Paul Maddox, age 9. Stones in my pocket that would never be put down. The convoy returned to Ridgerest without incident. 4 days, successful trade, new alliances forming across the distance. Hobbs met us at the gate and inventoried the seed stock with satisfaction, approaching joy. Eli was waiting behind him. My brother checked my face, my hands, my posture, reading me the way I'd once read our father for signs of damage, for evidence of cost. 4 days, he said. "You said 4 days." 4 days. "Okay." He handed me a plate of food. Oscar's vegetables, freshly harvested. I ate standing at the gate and watched the sun set over Ridgerest's wall and felt, for the first time, something other than survival. Something with a longer horizon. Something that might, if I allowed it, be called hope. The last crisis came on day 90, and it resolved not with violence or confrontation, but with something quieter and infinitely more difficult acceptance. My father found me at the logistics table in the town hall. Morning light streaming through windows that someone had recently cleaned. His eyes were clear. His hands were steady. He carried a folded piece of paper. "I want to talk to you," he said, "while I'm still sharp." I set down my pencil, gave him my full attention. The room was empty except for the maps and the morning stillness. "I've been writing letters," he said, "to your mother. I know she's probably gone. Mara and I have talked about it, about accepting things we can't confirm." He unfolded the paper, then refolded it without reading it. "I've also been thinking about the shelter, about why I built it." "Dad, let me finish, please." He sat across from me. "I built that shelter because my brain told me the world was ending. And instead of treating the message, I treated the world. I poured everything I had into preparation for a catastrophe that my illness manufactured. That your mother saw it, and I didn't. That she tried to tell me, and I chose the fear over her. The catastrophe happened, Dad. You were right. No, a catastrophe happened. not the one I was preparing for. The odds of what actually occurred were astronomical. I could have spent those years being a husband and a father instead of a bunker builder. And the probability of needing that bunker was so vanishingly small that any rational assessment would have directed me toward my family. But it saved us. It saved you in spite of the reason it existed. That's not vindication. That's coincidence dressed up as prophecy. He placed the folded letter on the table between us. I want you to understand that because I see you building, Marcus. I see the way you work, the hours you keep, the way you pour yourself into systems and logistics until there's nothing left for sleeping or eating or being a 17-year-old boy. And I recognize it. It's me. The same engine, the same drive. And I need you to hear from me right now. While I'm clear enough to mean it, the work is not the whole of you. And the people around you are not variables in your calculations. They are the point. I didn't speak. Couldn't. The words had entered me in a place I'd sealed shut months ago. The room where the boy I'd been before the shelter still existed, waiting to be acknowledged. Eli needs a brother, my father continued. Not a logistics coordinator. Adrian needs a friend, maybe more than that, but that's your business. And you need to grieve. For your mother, for Pine Street, for the 3 names you carry, for the childhood you lost in my basement, learning to manage my illness when you should have been learning to drive. I pressed my palms against the table, felt the wood grain, the solidity, the realness of a surface that wasn't concrete, wasn't fluorescent lit, wasn't 12 feet underground. How do you know about the names? You talk in your sleep. Jamie, Destiny, Paul, over and over. The sealed room opened. Not all at once a crack, then a fracture, then a breach that I couldn't close and didn't try to. The grief poured through with a physical force that bent me forward over the table, forehead against my arms. And I cried for the first time since the night I'd begged my father not to leave. Cried for my mother in Boise, for 3 children I'd never met whose names I'd memorized from a radio broadcast because someone had to remember them. For the boy who'd climbed a fire escape alone at 16 and pretended he wasn't terrified. For all the versions of myself that the shelter had consumed and the surface had demanded. My father's hand settled on the back of my head. Heavy, warm, steady. The hands that had split firewood and rebuilt transmissions and shaken in the dark on the first night. They didn't shake now. He held me while I broke apart, and he didn't try to fix it, and he didn't tell me it was okay. He just stayed. That was enough. It was everything. I'm 23 now. I run logistics for Ridge Rest's northern expansion. 3 settlements linked by trade routes I designed on maps my father taught me to read. Adrian runs the medical network between them. Eli, 19 and taller than any of us, teaches mechanical engineering to apprentices using blueprints our father drew during his best mornings. My father died 2 years ago. A stroke in his sleep, his face peaceful in a way I'd never witnessed while he was awake. Mara said his brain had been extraordinary, a machine built for patterns, running at a frequency the world couldn't always match. I choose to believe the peace was real. I need to. Some nights, I sit at my desk and turn a radio dial through frequencies out of habit. Static, mostly. But sometimes voices, new settlements, growing networks, the stuttering heartbeat of a civilization reassembling itself from fragments. I keep a folded letter in my desk drawer. I've never read it. It's addressed to my mother, written in handwriting that was steady that morning. And I carry it the way I carry 3 children's names, not as weight, but as witness. My father built a shelter because he was afraid. I left it because I was ready.